Good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Smizer. I'm with the Stanley Foundation, and on behalf of the Nuclear Security Governance Experts Group, I'd like to welcome you. Thank you for joining us today, and I'm going to start with some brief introductory remarks to give you some idea of who we are and why we are here in front of you today. So with that, the first Nuclear Security Summit in 2010 came with increased top-level political attention to how countries worldwide are addressing the threat of nuclear terrorism. And while that attention has brought improvement to the global nuclear security system, it's still not commensurate with the threat. A more global, integrated, and comprehensive response is needed if we are to achieve a secure nuclear future. There's speculation by some that the 2014 Nuclear Security Summit here in The Hague will be the last. And this gives governmental leaders, as well as industry representatives and nuclear experts such as ourselves, a limited window of opportunity to create a foundation for a secure nuclear future to be built upon. In recognition of this window of opportunity, shortly after the 2012 summit in Seoul, 3 organizations, the Asan Institute for Policy Studies in the Republic of Korea, the Partnership for Global Security, and the Stanley Foundation, my organization in the United States, convened a diverse group of non-governmental experts that we tasked with developing innovative, forward-looking policy recommendations that would be in pursuit of a cohesive, responsive, and robust nuclear security regime. The group named themselves the Nuclear Security Governance Experts Group, or what we shorthand as NSGEG. So that's it's not a pretty acronym, but it is ours, so we own it. The NSGEG ambitiously held 3 workshops in the latter half of last year. And at those workshops, experts considered where there might be policy improvement in order for us to build a cohesive regime that would have transparency and accountability and to demonstrate effective nuclear security. The policy recommendations that resulted from those workshops were suggestions for near and medium-term action that would be in pursuit of the long-term goal of a cohesive, responsive, and robust nuclear security regime. The report that's pictured on the screen, and that you all have a lovely copy of on your chair, is the result of those workshops. There are actually as well individual workshop reports, but the piece of work that we came here to share with you today, Responsibility Beyond Rules, Leadership for a Secure Nuclear Future, captures the recommendations of this experts group and puts forward 5 major steps that can be taken to improve the regime. And then further, a full set of recommendations in the 3 areas that we studied within our workshops. Our panel here today is going to share more detail with you about those recommendations. The Asan Institute, one of those 3 organizations that convened the group, is represented by my colleague, Dr. Chang-Hoon Shin. Partnership for Global Security, another of the organizations that pulled the group together, is represented by Kenneth Luongo. And I represent the Stanley Foundation, the 3rd organization that convened the NSGEG. We're joined by 3 of our esteemed members of the group: John Bernhard, former Danish ambassador to the IAEA, Kenneth Brill, former U.S. ambassador to the IAEA, and Anita Nilsson, the former director of the IAEA Office of Nuclear Security.
Thanks, Jen, and thanks everybody for coming. It's great to see so many old friends and new friends here in the Netherlands, in The Hague. Our new report is about our ideas for how the summit process and beyond the summit process people should be thinking about nuclear security and where the issue needs to go, in our opinion. Both diagnostic and it's also prescriptive. And I'm just going to start and give just a brief description of what nuclear security is, because in the 3 summits, the Washington Summit and the Seoul Summit, and now the Netherlands, there has, among the public and among the press, I think, in particular, been some concern or some question about what nuclear security actually is. And whether it's non-proliferation or it's nuclear arms control, does it have a relationship to nuclear safety? In our opinion, nuclear security is something that undergirds the entire nuclear system because it cuts across all of those issues. So it's actually quite fundamental. The first point I want to make about the current system for nuclear security, the global system, is that it's not adequate to address the challenges of the 21st century. The challenges are a variety of different categories, but they include accidents at nuclear facilities like Fukushima, intentional acts of nuclear terrorism, and it also includes nuclear material and radiological material. Radiological being this particular, that which is of high intensity. The evolution of this regime has improved it over time, and in particular since September 11th, 2001, it's improved. But in our view, and in my view in particular, I think it's really incomplete and insufficient at the moment. It's really much less developed than other nuclear disciplines like safeguards and nuclear safety in terms of transparency, in terms of international standards, and also in terms of commitments. The second fundamental point I want to make about this subject is that its improvement is not impeded by technical considerations. The technical fixes to this problem are actually not going to require new technology development. The impediments are political, and we have to figure out how to overcome these political impediments. One way that this problem has been addressed is through the creation of this Nuclear Security Summit process, because it's brought together high-level political leaders to talk about a subject that has traditionally been very technical. But it's difficult when you have 50-plus nations to focus on what needs to be done, and a lot easier to focus on what can be done. And I think that that's where we have seen this process arrive at up to this point. Our objective is to prevent nuclear terrorism, prevent nuclear catastrophes. And our members, as Jen said, come from a variety of different nuclear backgrounds, including from industry, including from safeguards, from safety to some degree, and from security. And they also come from a variety of different countries. And that was intentional, to try and have a network that was broad and also had multiple disciplines in it. But the other thing I want to say about our members is that they're all political realists. And I think that the suggestions that some of what we're talking about might be politically naive or incomprehensible to achieve, I think, is just not realistic. I think this group understands and realizes what needs to be done. So you may have seen at the outset, and Michelle, maybe you want to put it back, this advertisement that we've developed, which is on the left-hand side. And the focus is, as you can see, on strengthening weak links in the system, but also very much on what the essence of this is, which is we will need to protect the international economy from the consequences of a nuclear catastrophe. And I just want to talk for a second about what those consequences are. Fukushima is estimated to have cost, or will cost over 10 years, $100 to $250 billion in terms of cleanup, rebuilding, insurance costs, compensation to victims, contaminated land, purchases, etc. If you look at what might happen in an urban area, the price is going to be, of course, much more significant. Also, if there's an act of nuclear terrorism or some kind of a similar catastrophe, including using a dirty bomb, this radiological weapon, our view is that it's going to have a significant impact on the global economy, and in particular on developing economies that are dependent on exports. And I looked into this and found that in 2011, the total global trade amount was $18 trillion, and 47% of that $18 trillion was accounted for by developing economies and the Commonwealth of Independent States. And that's risen significantly throughout the decade from 2010 through 2000, from 2000 to 2011. So my point about nuclear security is that it's not just about the security of weapons that are in materials that are in weapons or that can be put into crude weapons. It's about improving the security of nuclear power plants, protection against cyber threats, improving the security of high-intensity radioactive sources, which exist in almost every single hospital in every nation, protecting people's, families, and economic growth from what we consider to be preventable nuclear dangers in order to secure a create a secure nuclear future. So let me turn to the report and try to give you an outline of what it is that we're proposing. We think that there are three major problems with the current system. The first is the need to improve regime cohesion. The second is to promote greater transparency. And then the third is to build international confidence in the system. And we have proposed 5 different paths to address these 3 challenges. The first one is on this question of the definition of nuclear security. If you look at the Washington Summit focused almost exclusively on the security of fissile material, because Obama's goal was secure all vulnerable nuclear materials in 4 years. The Seoul Summit expanded the definition to include radiological security and also the interface between nuclear security and nuclear safety as a result of Fukushima. And if you look at the IAEA definition, it's also much broader, excuse me, than just fissile material. So I think if you're going to talk about nuclear security, you need to talk about all of these different things, not just fissile material part of it. The second path forward that we're talking about, or that we're advocating, is universalizing and maximizing, not just universalizing, but also maximizing the value of the current regime. And others are going to talk about these details, so I'm not going to go into them now. But the current regime does have a lot of value, but it hasn't really been exploited to the maximum degree. There are provisions in the different agreements that could be utilized. And then secondly, it needs to be universalized because there's a number of countries that aren't participating in all of the different instruments. Third, we're advocating this principle of continuous improvement. And here, let me just take a second and talk about what that idea is and also what the relationship between our vision is and the practical steps. In our view, that this political process, any political process, if it doesn't have a clear objective, is never going to know when it reaches its goal. And so for us, the ultimate goal of this nuclear security summit process and whatever comes after it is that we should have a unified and effective nuclear security regime with no weak links and the confirmation that no weak links exist. This is not going to be easy to do. It's something which is going to take place over time, which is why we've made a number of suggestions for short and medium-term actions in addition to outlining what this ultimate vision is. We think there's a connection between vision and then the steps that it takes to get there. And we call this process a process of continuous improvement because it allows for a continuum of action that moves from more aggressive voluntary actions to a system of what we're calling confirmed performance to ultimately binding obligations. The fourth element that we address in our report is the question of political impediments and what the path forward is here. And let me just touch on 4 of the key political issues. One is to transcend these corrosive politics of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, where the countries that don't have nuclear weapons say, we don't want to do anything more until there's disarmament, and the and this whole issue of nuclear security is somehow a new obligation that we're being asked to take on that doesn't apply to us because we don't have fissile material. That's just not an accurate description of what it is that we're talking about, which is in part why we named this report Responsibility Beyond the Rules, because this is an issue of global responsibility. And one way we have put forth to try and transcend this is a statement of principles that can be opened by, for signature by all countries, a version of which is in an appendix to this report. The second political issue is to streamline the current regime because we think that there's a lot of overlap in the regime currently, and it places a lot of burden on small countries that don't have large bureaucracies that are being asked to attend all these different meetings. Third, to better empower and equip the IAEA. The IAEA is an essential player in this job, and it has an essential job to do, but it really needs a mandate that is strengthened beyond the mandate that it has today. And then finally, the fourth political issue that we think is important is to keep the political momentum on the nuclear security agenda alive whatever happens to the nuclear security summits. There's a proposal that maybe 2014 will be the last one, maybe 2016 will be the last one, but at any rate, you need a mechanism to allow the political input into this that can drive improvement. Finally, our fifth major path forward is the call for a unifying instrument for the current nuclear security regime in the form of a framework convention. We think that a framework convention will allow for the unification, harmonization, and strengthening of the regime, and that it will allow it to endure and grow and remain strong into the future. Finally, because I'm at the end of my time, let me just say a word about the importance of The Hague as the next host and what we consider to be criteria for success for the next summit. The Hague, as the seat of international law, in our opinion, is an important venue for the summit, and it has unique characteristics which are very different from Washington and very different from Seoul. And as a result, it imbues it with unique responsibilities. Whereas the Washington summit focused on fissile material security and the Seoul summit opened up the scope, the Hague summit, in our view, must lay the foundation for a concrete future improvement in the nuclear security regime. As the home of international law, we think that it's ideally suited to tackle this particular issue. And we have defined in the report 3 criteria for success of this particular summit. The first is a commitment to sustain high-level political attention to the issue irrespective of the future of the summit process. Second is agreement on the importance of greater information sharing to improve nuclear security. And third is formal recognition of the need for a unifying instrument to be followed by a process for the development and negotiation of a framework agreement with the goal of entry into force by 2020. We think that Washington and Seoul were absolutely essential, but we're looking at the Hague Summit as an opportunity to launch essentially a 6-year process that's going to result in a system that's going to be much, much more robust and much more flexible to deal with the threats of the 21st century. And with that, I'm going to end and turn it over to my colleagues who are going to talk about some of these issues in detail. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll start saying goedemiddag to everybody. It's a special pleasure for me to be back in The Hague, where I was ambassador of Denmark for 4 years, 2001 to 5. And since then, the status of The Hague as the capital of international law, I think, has been even more solidly established. And this is, of course, also one of the reasons why there are high expectations about the results of the Nuclear Security Summit in The Hague next year. As you have already heard, we think that there are many weaknesses and gaps in the current nuclear security regime. And one of the fundamental weaknesses is that we are still far from having a universal regime. This is so in spite of the fact that in a globalized world, most nuclear security threats are international by nature. No state is immune to such threats, regardless of whether it has nuclear arms or installations or not. In most cases, the effects of a nuclear terrorist attack would not be limited to one state's territory, and besides, the risks connected to transit of nuclear material may also be present anywhere in the world. If, for example, we imagine that a nuclear terrorist attack happened in a big city, the direct consequences, of course, would be devastating to human lives and to property in the area, also in a long-term perspective. But such an attack would also have a tremendously strong negative impact on world economy for years, and all states, without exception, would be affected. So if the threats are more than ever of a universal character, why has an effective universal response not been achieved? This is not only because some states, wrongly, in my view, do not consider themselves as likely victims of nuclear terrorism. It is also because the traditional concept of national sovereignty often has a very restrictive impact on the willingness of states to enter into binding international agreements in this field. Nuclear security traditionally is seen as linked to strong national interests, national institutions, national intelligence, and strict confidentiality, and the current regime is therefore nationally focused with only few and limited international obligations. So a more appropriate balance between national sovereignty interests and international responsibility has to be found. Some progress, of course, has been achieved during the last decades, but much more can and should be done, both within the existing structure of international rules and recommendations, but certainly also beyond those rules. Like in many other fields of international cooperation, states should recognize that if they are a little less hesitant about sharing their nuclear security measures with others, they will be compensated by the benefits of other states acting in the same way, thereby creating a more transparent, cohesive, and secure international regime. So, universalizing the efforts is crucial. The Nuclear Security Summit process has been and is very valuable, especially because of the high-level political attention and focus on nuclear security which it has created, and also various other processes and initiatives from larger or smaller groups of states have been very useful. But in the long term, it is not sufficient to agree on stronger commitments and more effective implementation within restricted groups of states. The entire international community must be engaged in the efforts to establish a strong and credible nuclear security regime. Obviously, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, has some comparative advantages in this regard. It has a virtually universal membership, and it has recognized experience and expertise in the field of nuclear security. The IAEA is constantly giving valuable advice to its member states, both by producing numerous guidelines and recommendations, and by offering practical advice on the ground. And the work of the IAEA will continue to be indispensable. But it can only do what its member states want and allow it to do. And it remains to be seen if and when member states are ready to give the IAEA the tools and funds which it would need to build a strong and universal defense against nuclear terrorism within the UN system. So how does the international regime look at this point? It consists of a patchwork of treaties, resolutions, recommendations, declarations, of which only a few are legally binding and very few of a universal character. Some of them are listed on the screen, and I would just briefly mention the main contents of them. First, the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material, the CPPNM, from 1979, and its amendment from 2005. The main focus of that convention is on protecting nuclear material during international transport, and on making certain offenses, for example, robbery of nuclear material, punishable under national law. The amendment from 2005 is quite important as it enlarges the scope considerably by covering also protection of nuclear material in domestic use and storage and transport, and by prescribing enhanced international cooperation. But unfortunately, the amendment has not yet entered into force 8 years after its adoption, as it needs ratification by 2/3 of the 148 parties to the convention. And so far, only 66 states have ratified. The next one mentioned on the screen is the International Convention for the Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism. It's from 2005, and it has 115 signatories, but only 84 ratifications. It is in force, but of course only for the states who have ratified it. And it is primarily an international criminal law instrument, which is known also from other kinds of terrorism, which defines certain acts regarding nuclear installations and material or radioactive material as criminal offenses, and obliges states parties to extradite or to prosecute alleged offenders. So like the other conventions of this kind, anti-terrorism conventions, it focuses mainly on what to do after a terrorist act than on how to prevent it from happening. The only two universally binding documents of relevance for nuclear security are two resolutions from the United Nations Security Council, 1540 and 1373. They are adopted according to Chapter 7 of the UN Charter and thereby become legally binding for all states. Resolution 1540 obliges states to refrain from supporting non-state actors who attempt to acquire, use, or transfer inter alia nuclear weapons and their delivery systems. And states also have to combat illicit trafficking in such items and to establish effective export controls. The other resolution, 1373, was adopted shortly after 9/11 and deals with all acts of terrorism, focusing inter alia on preventing and suppressing financing and preparation of terrorism. Both resolutions are, of course, of value as being obligatory and binding for all states, but they are of a very, very general nature. In addition to these few legally binding documents, there is a rather large number of IAEA recommendations and guidelines, which certainly are very useful and they are being kept up to date constantly. But the problem is states are free to use them or not. So I think two general weaknesses of the current regime are obvious. Firstly, there are few and modest obligations. There are no common standards, there's little transparency, and there are no international assessment procedures. And secondly, even this rather non-ambitious current regime has not been able to attract universal participation. There are various ways towards creating a stronger universal system, which some of my colleagues here will elaborate on. I'll only mention a couple of tools which could be applied on a voluntary basis in the short term, but which could still contribute to universality. They are both mentioned in the report as appendixes. One possibility could be that the Nuclear Security Summit in The Hague next year produced a list of basic principles for nuclear security, which would be open for all states to subscribe to. This could also be a way of addressing the lack of universal participation in the NSS process, which sometimes has been criticized. This idea is mentioned in Appendix 1 with a list of possible basic principles. Another way of promoting universal adherence to the current regime could be to create a checklist of the various elements of the regime, encouraging states to check which of the treaties, recommendations, or other parts of the regime they are participating in or implementing, or which they are not part of. This could show need for improvement and motivate action to address weaknesses. At the outset, such checklists would probably be exclusively for domestic use, but later it might be possible to authorize the IAA to receive the completed checklists, subject, of course, to confidentiality, which you know from other systems in the IAA, including in nuclear safety. Gradually, this might lead to the development of a practice of sending more detailed national reports to the IAEA, and maybe even at some point to some mechanism whereby the effectiveness and comprehensiveness of nuclear security in the IAEA member states could be evaluated during this exchange of reports. And this idea is mentioned in Appendix 4. Such steps, as I just mentioned now, might in the relatively short term contribute to a more widespread acceptance and implementation of the elements of the current regime, but an effective international regime requires more and stronger obligations. It requires ways to evaluate whether they are actually implemented in practice, and not least, it requires a virtually universal participation in such a strengthening of the regime. This must be the long-term objective, but it must not take too long. Thank you.
And I would first like to mention appreciations that this meeting takes place in The Hague, in the Netherlands, and that it is very welcome and logic that the next summit, 2014, happens in this country. Because from my earlier days in the IAEA, it was a clear experience that the Netherlands stood in the forefront of introducing helpful items, helpful measures that could bring the whole field of nuclear security forward. And for the next summit, if it is focusing on shaping a system for the future, that would be very much logical and in line with earlier. So it's nice to be here. My task here is to talk about communication and transparency. And it's part of that to make arguments for promoting more transparency. But that has to be seen in a perspective. And we should recall the perspective of the summit when the process started in 2010, that it had basically two objectives. One was, as Ken said, to secure vulnerable material, vulnerable fissile material. And the other one was to shape a stronger system for security of nuclear material. But this has changed, and in Seoul, the scope of the summit process was extended to also include radiological security, or as we say, security of radioactive materials that is not fissile. And in the wake of the accident in Fukushima, it was also pointed to the importance of the nexus between nuclear security and nuclear safety. This whole demonstrated that the subject or the subjects has to be seen in an integrated manner, has to be seen in its whole. And the viability of such a strengthened system is closely linked with questions of transparency and accountability. And the effectiveness of such a system depends on it to be well-defined, coherent, and globally implemented to recognized standards. And I would like to extend that and say that it is almost a right of the international community and the general public to know that the nuclear industry and the use of radioactive sources is managed wherever they are in excellence, that the highest standards of nuclear safety and nuclear security are implemented, and also to know that these activities are performed for peaceful purposes. And to obtain confidence that this is the case requires transparency and sufficient information available, both on the setup of the system and how it is implemented. And I agree with others that for the moment we don't have sufficient information in this regard. If we look back at the 2010 summit and the securing of vulnerable materials, we know that there are some progress. That has been relatively clearly demonstrated. We have progress there. We have numbers that we can compare. But when it comes to the second arm, building the robust security system, we are not quite at the same point. And such a system, which was focused in Seoul, has to deal with security, of course, and links to both safeguards and peaceful uses. And it has to be broader in scope, not limited to fissile material, but also expanded into radioactive sources and normal use of source nuclear material. And in some cases, systems need to expand into equipment that are essential for the safe operation of nuclear facilities. We continue to receive information about illicit trafficking incidents. And in some cases, we also receive information about the incidents at nuclear power plants. There may be groups that have penetrated borders, etc. But we have very little information about what's the setup, what is the goal for a management system, how should it operate. And because of this gap, it's easy for the general public to draw the conclusion that this is an insufficient system. But even if it is lacking, has gaps, weaknesses, it is also not very clear that how we are working to strengthen it. And there is a need to move in that direction. And information sharing and international collaboration is the only way to address the major transnational challenges that comes with nuclear security. And thereby, the references to confidentiality of sensitive information, in my view, has been overused. It is true that sensitive information on security systems must be kept confidential, but it should not limit the need or the responses to the desire to know how, in principle, systems are shaped, how challenges in the security field are being addressed. Because if this kind of dialogue is not happening, it is not well understood how the system will work and how the matters are dealt with. So new mechanisms to share information, to share in experiences and practices are needed. And of course, to meet the challenge of maintaining confidentiality of the sensitive information, yet enabling these broader exchanges. When it comes to approaches and experiences, we have a number of already existing conventions that include obligations of exchanging information on incidents, on the standards and response arrangements. But we have a feeling when looking at how this is implemented that it is not sufficiently used. There is room for improvement here. And if we had a forum, a dedicated forum, to receive information, to push the envelope, to deal with it and to draw the conclusions from it, it could also be a tool to advance the system as a whole. The IAEA plays a pivotal role in this regard. And it does that in combination with political processes that happens, for example, in the summit context or in other initiatives. And one of the challenges for the future will be how to make best use of the central function and the central role of the IAEA and how it can help the system as a whole. A performance review process associated with international conventions is normally a good route to have a political process in place. And in principle, there is a possibility to have that with the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material and also the Convention on the Nuclear Terrorism. But it is so cumbersome and so complex that it would not work in reality. A simplified process would be better suited to keep the high perspectives of how the system would work. And one of the challenges in front of us is how to put such a review and pushing process in place in combination with the implementation processes that work more on the, in the practical sense. So we need regular, predictable processes, not ad hoc ones, because we already have the ad hoc ones, but we need to put them together so that it becomes a pattern and there becomes predictability and a road ahead if there are complex issues that needs to be dealt with. Implementation standard and practices, they are key for effectiveness and transparency. And without established standards of performance, we can't claim effectiveness. We need a yardstick to measure against. A dynamic and complex field of operation, as we have in the nuclear field, with the very many applications, requires such a dynamic and to-the-point standards. It makes a difference. So continuous improvements also depends on having mechanisms available to review the function of the system, to propose new standards, to identify where there is a gap, where things are not good enough. And we need to have also complementary, more short-lived pieces of guidance that are normally referred to as best practices. Best practices of how to implement, how to reach these defined higher level goals. But this doesn't happen without collaboration, without exchanges of information and routes and mechanisms for how to do this. I would also say that for the future, if we look at an extended use of nuclear energy, which still can happen in the world, more use of radioactive sources for medical purposes or industrial purposes, we need to advance the envelope for the standards. Maybe we should try to find out whether international nuclear standards would be an option. And not safety standards, security standards, accounting rules, again, all these ad hoc, but to see how can we have a common, comprehensive set of standards that are applicable. In such a system, we would also require performance assessments and peer reviews. And this happens, and I think it's appropriate to mention also here that the Netherlands was in the forefront of having such international peer reviews on its nuclear activities. But still, it's in the infancy. It is not something which is generally applied from country to country. And we need to look at what are the possibilities to institutionalize such peer reviews, and what are the mechanisms that could be available to share information that could actually move the system further as a whole. And the IAEA serves a key function in all these areas. But as was said, its role needs to be strengthened to serve new assignments. For example, by institutionalizing some new functions and by streamlining or broadening presently implemented processes. And by doing that, of course, it could significantly contribute to obtaining a global, effective, and informative nuclear security system that helps build confidence both in the international community and with the general public. And of course, the upcoming Nuclear Security Summit is an ideal opportunity to address these matters and to set the agenda for the future. Thank you.
I want to join my colleagues in thanking you all for coming today and saying how pleased we are to be here in The Hague, particularly as we look ahead to the Nuclear Security Summit of 2014, which my colleagues have already mentioned. I think there can be little doubt that in the wake of a terrorist nuclear attack anywhere in the world, that the public at large would be shocked that their leaders had allowed such a thing to happen, and that there would be immediately a high-profile global effort to develop and implement a new approach to nuclear security. The goals of this global initiative, this high-level global initiative, would be to ensure that no such attack could ever happen again. The publics would demand that. And it would also be designed to help rebuild confidence in a shattered global economy and a shattered global political system. This initiative would achieve these goals by identifying and fixing weak links and gaps in the existing nuclear security arrangements. And I think it's safe to predict that the resulting system would look very different from what we have today. Now, I think that most people would agree that nuclear terrorism is a threat that must be prevented. It's not something we should be thinking about, well, how do we respond to it? I mean, do we really need to wait for disaster to strike before we put in place a global nuclear security system commensurate with the risks of such terrorism and the consequences of such an act? What stands in the way of having a more robust nuclear security system? Well, as Ken, the other Ken on this panel, said a couple of minutes ago, and as others have alluded to, the challenge to having a global nuclear security system, a really robust one, is really not technical. The scientists and engineers at the IAEA, in industry, and in governments know full well what is required to protect nuclear material at individual sites and in national systems. For example, the IAEA publication, The Nuclear Security Fundamentals, provides all the building blocks needed for both site-specific and national nuclear security systems. Now, the challenge to putting our collective expertise to work in having a robust global system to prevent nuclear terrorism is political. It's not technical. Building such a system requires transcending the traditional view of nuclear responsibility, as well as some of the politics that have grown up around the NPT that affect the way many states look at the threat of nuclear terrorism. Now, from the beginning of the nuclear age, I think it's safe to say that nuclear security has been seen exclusively as a state responsibility. This is due in large part to the military nature of the early nuclear programs and the subsequent view that nuclear technology represents sort of the crown jewels of a nation's scientific and technical accomplishments. Now, frankly, I think the life scientists in the world today would say that's probably not the right view, but nonetheless, that is the view. Meanwhile, the NPT has spawned concerns among non-nuclear weapon states about unequal obligations placed on their nuclear activities. I think this in turn has produced a two-part perception on nuclear terrorism. The first is that it's a problem only for the nuclear weapon states. They have fissile material, so they should have the burden for dealing with this issue. And the second perception is that as I said, non-nuclear weapon states shouldn't be asked to do anything more in terms of obligations related to their nuclear activities, that they should live up to what's in the NPT and nothing more. Let's take a look at those two perceptions briefly. The material needed for nuclear terrorism is not a monopoly of the 5 NPT nuclear weapons states. Today, some 28 states have fissile material, and a much larger number, as several of my colleagues have mentioned, have highly radioactive sources. The fissile material that the 28 states have could be used for an improvised nuclear device, and of course the highly radioactive sources could be used for a dirty bomb. And trafficking in nuclear materials has occurred in a wide variety of states. Meanwhile, study after study has shown a terrorist nuclear attack, particularly one that involved an improvised nuclear device, would have profoundly negative consequences far beyond the state in which the event occurred. The global economy would take a big and prolonged hit as trade and travel would be halted for a time and resumed under much more cumbersome and expensive conditions. International investment priorities would change, with negative consequences for international institutions ranging from multilateral development banks to the UN, and national and global security perceptions and actions would change significantly. A nuclear terrorist attack would affect all states, and as Kofi Annan pointed out a few years ago, would have devastating secondary and tertiary effects and victims in the developing world. Finally, if we didn't know this before, Fukushima made it clear that in this globalized world, problems in one country can produce perturbations in the system, ripple effects, that have an impact and that have consequences in states far away. In short, the perception held by some that nuclear terrorism is a problem only for a few is wrong. Nuclear terrorism is a problem for each and every one of us. And dealing with it requires a global system that is built on a foundation of state sovereignty and responsibility, but that also includes obligations to the international community. Now, what kind of obligations to the international community? Anita has already addressed the need for transparency and improved forms of information sharing. But in addition, I would note that that an effective nuclear security system must incorporate 2 other forms of obligations. First, a robust nuclear security system should promote a culture of continuous improvement by states as well as by the global system as a whole. The threat of nuclear terrorism is not static, so national and global nuclear security efforts need to have commitments to be dynamic with mechanisms to promote, share, and adopt improvements. And second, a global nuclear security system, like a national or even a site-specific nuclear security system, must be based on the principle of confirmed performance. Nuclear terrorists, as all other terrorists, seek to exploit weak links, and nuclear terrorists seek to exploit weak links in facility, national, and global nuclear security arrangements. States have an obligation to those that would be affected by nuclear terrorism, their citizens, but also their fellow states, to demonstrate they are not just adopting nuclear security guidelines, but are implementing them effectively. Now, given the need to build and strengthen political will to develop and implement a robust global nuclear security system, improvements in nuclear security in the coming decade need to move from voluntary actions to binding obligations. The IAEA and the nuclear security summits have identified a number of steps to strengthen nuclear security that are wholly voluntary. Civil society and others should be urging national leaders to adopt and implement these recommendations expeditiously. But voluntary actions are not enough to strengthen the weak links and to build public and international confidence that everything possible that could be done is being done to prevent nuclear terrorism. So over time, some of the non-binding recommendations, such as those by the IAEA, should form the basis for binding obligations on states. Similarly, while states may voluntarily adopt transparency measures and peer reviews today, in the future, transparency and peer reviews should be based on binding obligations. We must build the political will to act as if nuclear terrorism is the threat to global prosperity and stability that it really is. This will require moving from a largely informal nuclear regime that we have today that has many weak links and gaps to a unified regime that recognizes state sovereignty as well as state obligations to the international community. Developing such a global regime will build strong international confidence, not only that nuclear terrorism will be prevented, but more generally in the safety and security of nuclear energy. Now, the need for such a global system is not just the view of the experts behind the report that you all have. Earlier this month, former U.S. Secretaries of State Henry Kissinger and George Shultz, former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry, and former U.S. Senator Sam Nunn had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal calling on world leaders to use the 2014 Nuclear Security Summit as an opportunity to commit to developing a comprehensive global nuclear materials security system. So we think we're in good company with our recommendations.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Brill, and good afternoon, distinguished guests. I am Chang-Won Shin from the Asan Institute for Policy Studies, an independent think tank based in Seoul, the Republic of Korea. As the last presenter, I'm mandated to address the topic of Nuclear Security Framework Convention. It is my great honor, particularly as an international lawyer, to have the chance to talk about the Framework Convention here at The Hague, the city of peace and justice, and the capital city of international law. This term has been repeated 4th time today. Anyway, I'm going to brief you on why we need the Framework Convention and what elements should be included in the Framework Convention. With regard to the necessity for the Framework Convention, let me first say that the current international framework for nuclear security is too fragmented, being composed of piecemeal mixture of hard laws and soft laws. As Mr. Luongo stated already, the strengthening of nuclear security will lead to a strengthening of the entire nuclear system, including nuclear safeguards and nuclear safety. While nuclear safeguards and the nuclear safety regime are currently regulated by comprehensive and legally binding international treaties, such as the NPT and the Convention on Nuclear Safety, nuclear security does not have such a comprehensive international treaty mechanism. For instance, with regard to nuclear safeguards, international obligations as well as national obligations are imposed upon states. But it is well known that the responsibility for nuclear safety ultimately rests with individual sovereign states. Nonetheless, our international community has agreed to have the Convention on Nuclear Safety, concluded under the auspices of the IAEA. In other words, on the issue of nuclear safety, while reaffirming the responsibility of individual sovereign states, the international community has also gone beyond individual state responsibility by concluding a comprehensive international treaty mechanism. The responsibility for nuclear security also rests with individual sovereign states, the same with the case of nuclear safety. But why should we be satisfied with a collection of fragmented norms and standards? And why should we remain satisfied with the patchwork approach without any comprehensive international treaty? The patchwork approach to nuclear security should be ameliorated. But in what format or solution can it be ameliorated? I don't think that the appropriate format or solution is to move forward just with voluntary measures as those contained in the Nuclear Security Summit process. We should begin with more aggressive voluntary actions, but it must also evolve beyond voluntary commitments and standards. The second reason why we need a framework convention is that we need a sustainable mechanism after the end of the nuclear security summits. What do you think makes a mechanism for nuclear security sustainable beyond 2014 or 2016? I want to say that the formation of the framework convention will help create a sustainable mechanism. Due to the Washington and Seoul nuclear security summits, the issue of nuclear security has gained widespread public attention as well as attention at the highest political levels. Without mentioning cooperation at the intergovernmental level, technically specialized networks engaged in cooperation and operating with global scope have emerged in civil society as well. Since nuclear security is a global issue or concern that necessitates expert cooperation and which also transgresses national boundaries, it is difficult to regulate through traditional international law. National laws arising from the traditional concept of responsibility of individual sovereign states seem insufficient due to the transnational nature of nuclear security. So far, we have witnessed, particularly in the field of trade, environment, human rights, and crime prevention, the networks of cooperation have been evolving and have led to the adoption of norms and rules among like-minded states. They have also adopted forms of behaviors or comprehensive solutions in order to coordinate or harmonize national or regional laws and regulations. Getting back to the current nuclear security architecture or governance, we have been concerned about the patchwork approach. I mean the fragmentation of relevant rules and regulations. For example, the fragmented rules and regulations do not have any clear relationship to each other, and the parties to the relevant international treaties are different, so that the only way to reach harmonization of national laws is the universal ratification of all the relevant international treaties. However, given the fact that we have tens of international treaties relevant to nuclear security, do you think this will be accomplished in a real world? There must be a certain umbrella or framework approach that helps consolidate and formalize the current patchwork approach into a comprehensive nuclear security regime that is based on obligations and actions contained in the relevant legally binding international instruments. The Washington and the Seoul communiques, the products of the two nuclear security summits, encourage universal ratification of the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material, CPPNM, and its amendment, and the International Convention for the Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism. However, as you may know, the CPPNM amendment has not yet entered into force. Some might say that a framework convention could get in the way of countries ratifying the CPPNM and its amendment. While I agree that the amendment is very crucial for the goals of nuclear security, but I dare to say it is not a panacea for global nuclear security governance. especially when looking into the way it is being implemented. No sufficient ratification of the amendment and non-use of some of the Convention's mechanisms, for example, for information sharing and regular meetings of the parties. The Framework Convention will be open for signature by all the states in our international community. This will be a requisite for making our global nuclear security governance sustainable, because this will overcome the lack of universal participation, irrespective of whether they are invited to the Nuclear Security Summit or not, irrespective of whether they have nuclear materials or not, irrespective whether they have nuclear weapons or not. The objective of the Framework Convention would be clear and simple. It could provide for regular peer review mechanisms for enhancing transparency in nuclear security. This objective is not an obstacle to the universal ratification of the CPPNM and its amendment. It is an enhancement to them. We, some of the members of the Nuclear Security Governance Experts Group, have been engaged in drafting the Framework Convention as a brainstorming exercise. The major focus is on how to regularize a peer review mechanism to strengthen transparency in nuclear security without prejudice to a sovereign state's individual rights and responsibilities in this area. In addition, we, the colleagues involved in the drafting process, are thinking of the following elements as well. First, we are thinking of building robust capacity so that all the state parties establish their own effective national nuclear security implementation regime. Second, setting priorities in international assistance so that international assistance may be streamlined to the states in need of financial and technical assistance. Third, engaging stakeholders so as to facilitate cooperation with each other, enabling a wide variety of states and non-state actors to bring to bear their resources and expertise for our shared goals in nuclear security. Since the Nuclear Security Summit is a process that is comprised of various voluntary commitments, no obligatory measures or actions can be expected to emerge. However, as a final suggestion, if the Hague Summit ends up with a formal recognition of the need for the Framework Convention with goal of entry into force by 2020, as Mr. Luongo already mentioned, this will definitely be conducive to achieving a sustainable mechanism for nuclear security without losing the momentum, political momentum, generated by the summit process in nuclear security. Thank you very much.